We're live, yeah. Good evening, everybody, those online and those here in the building. It's, again, very good to see you all here tonight. So tonight we're pushing on onto the third of the three kings that we're looking at. Obviously, maybe not obviously, Israel had lots of kings. It wasn't just these three kings, but these three were the first, and they tend to be quite dominant in the narrative and in what we recall, and a lot of the text is devoted to them, and so that's why we're focusing on those three in this study. So we finished with David more or less last week. David is the father of Solomon, so there is a hereditary behind him, tried to take hold of the throne, but David had been anointed. Whereas here we see the passing of the throne, the passing of the reign through the hereditary line, and Solomon was the child of David and Bathsheba. We spent a fair while talking about Bathsheba. So Bathsheba was they lost their child that was born from the great tragedy of the sin that David had committed, but they brought Bathsheba into his home, into his palace, and they bore a son who became Solomon. And we mentioned it briefly last week, and so tonight we'll basically be going through kind of chapters 2 through 11 of 1 Kings, not in, again, verse by verse or anything like that. A lot of the chapters are actually quite boring lists of people and materials and whatnot. So there's not a lot of moral lessons to be learned from such things. But nevertheless, we saw at the start there that in the waning days of David, that fellow by the name of Adonijah had designs on the throne, and it was, and Bathsheba sort of was aware of this, and she was angling or making sure that her son Solomon, who had been promised the throne, was properly anointed by David. People could understand that it was indeed to be Solomon who would be king. And so Adonijah does submit and acknowledge this. And we read last week in the last of the lesson that David's charge to Solomon, and how part of the charge was a great call to following God and to, again, moral, righteous leadership, and David understanding his relationship with God and trying to impress the importance of that. But then we also see in the latter half of the same charge the realpolitik of the day, if you like, the ways in which individual threats to the throne or individual grievances were to be taken care of. And so we see in 10 and 11 of chapter 2, David dying, and then in verse 12 that Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was firmly established. And I'm sure we appreciate that the kingdom of Solomon, the kingdom of Saul, the kingdom of David, both were really filled with bloodshed. You see these, I've not seen Game of Thrones or whatnot, but you understand the kind of the bloodshed that is part of so many of these narratives. Braveheart, a lot of this sort of the depictions of kingdoms, the depictions of from ancient times right through sort of medieval times we see, and let's be honest, in contemporary times as well, we see armies at war, we see bloodshed within palaces, and certainly within the peoples and the peoples in conflict. And you'd like to think that that there would be some learning, some recognition that, having 23,000 people killed in a day is a bad thing, and we don't want that thing. And that's 23,000 parents who mourn a child, and 23,000 lives that could be productively farming, whatever it is, or just at the very least that life is, a life that is unique and is no more at the point of the sword, the point of the arrow, the point of someone else's malice or fear, all sorts of reasons. The point being is that Solomon, and we'll look a bit later, does have a period of peace in the kingdom, but it's not all peaceful. Very often when you see transfers of power, you see accompanying that transfers of power what's called a purge. And sometimes it's not relating to bloodshed. Sometimes it's more just an exercise of authority, of I'm the boss now and this is how I'm going to show it. John Howard's government in 1996, famously, when they came to power, there was what they called the Night of the Long Knives, where they sacked about, 13 department heads or something like that, and really let everybody in Canberra know that there was a new boss in town, and that the old ways were swept aside for a new regime. Campbell Newman, famously, though he wasn't in power for very long, I think sacked 14,000 servants of the public pretty quickly, again trying to stamp his authority. We see also employment-related things. Joseph Stalin, perhaps most famously, held power by a gross series of purges where even people, maybe perhaps especially people that were close in his circle of advisors and leaders of the Soviet Russia, would be killed, would be assassinated, would be sent to the gulags, would be sent to the Russian steppe, STEPPE, which was, if not a death sentence, certainly carried with it extraordinarily hard labor. During the middle of the war in 1941 and 42, Stalin famously purged members of the Air Force and of the Army. Again, despotic, authoritarian, guilty of great bloodshed, and once you go down that path, you keep going down that path. Solomon does his own purge. Solomon settles scores, and we saw this when David took the throne from Saul, and Joab was, taking on Saul's son, and he killed, so they killed, so they killed, so they killed. A bit of this goes on again. So I said before that Adonijah had designs on the throne but had submitted. He is executed, again from verses 13 down to verse 25. Joab had aligned himself with Adonijah. He had not aligned himself with Solomon. So Joab, the sort of army general and really one of the prominent members of David's leadership and David's rule, one of those guilty of bloodshed, including David's own son. He is executed by Solomon in verses 28 down to 35. And you remember David said, Joab, this blood of innocent people is on your head, not on my family's head. And sort of Solomon pays that check, if you like. You might remember as well from last week, Shimel, the fellow who was mocking David when David was on the run, when David had to flee Jerusalem because, again, others had designs on on the throne, and so Shmuel was mocking David, and then when David was returning to regain the throne, he was all talking out of the other side of his mouth, and let's not worry about those things. And Joab wanted to put him to death, but David said, no, leave him be. But the old chickens coming home to roost, or whatever it might be, Solomon said to him, verse 44, you know, as your heart acknowledges, all the wickedness that you did to my father David. Therefore the Lord will return your wickedness on your own head. The French have a saying, plus ça change, which means the more things change, the more they stay the same. And the French say it a lot more romantically than English, perhaps. But it's the story of history, isn't it? It's the story of humankind and power. It takes a lot to stop these things. It takes a lot to not be vengeful. It takes a lot to let vengeance be the Lord's. It takes a lot to, for instance, where David exercised grace towards Mephibosheth. And we see on, I think, several occasions where David, obviously Saul, but where I think this is the moments perhaps where it shines the brightest, his man after God's own heart, where the natural response and the response of many around about him seemed to be one of vengeance and bloodthirstiness, and he seemed to pull back from that at times. Obviously other times he didn't. And Solomon begins his reign in the vein of the vengeful, and again, God at times calls for people to be put to death, and God calls or allows, at the very least, Israel to put to death great numbers of people, armies, of opposing nations. God allows Israel's armies to be defeated at times at great cost, and I'm sure theologians throughout the centuries have tried to wrestle with this almost seeming, paradox, and the preciousness of life, and how cheaply it is taken very often. And so, again, it would seem that God certainly isn't preventing or actively preventing Solomon from carrying these things out. We can see that, someone like Joab lived by the sword, and very often when you live by the sword, you do indeed die by the sword. And so I'm not, it's very difficult to pass moral judgment and to say, Solomon's starting out in a terrible vein or anything like that. At the very least we can say is that this is the reality of how life was lived, and as I said, to be honest, I suspect in Afghanistan at the moment there are purges taking place. There are people who were part of the former regime who were supported by obviously the Americans and the international coalition, who could not get on a plane out and who are either hiding for their life or have lost their life because the new people in town are exercising their authority and seem to be less of the John Howard Campbell Newman and more of the bloodthirsty kind. And so, the loss of life in such a way is wrong, but it's also real. And this side of eternity, we have to reconcile with that and wrestle with that. But that's not all Solomon does, of course. Well, I know a lot of that stuff is heavy, but as I said, that stuff carries forward, and so I think there is lessons to be learned and observations to be made about the fact that it does bleed into the next regime, and one would definitely say into future regimes as well, in Israel's kings and leaders. So Solomon has, or he creates a treaty with Egypt and uses marriage for this treaty. Again, this is nothing new, or nothing unique, perhaps I should say. If you have any understanding of European aristocracy and European kings and queens, you'll understand that I think 2/3 of British royalty is German because of the, marriages of convenience, marriages of what's the word? Diplomacy, really. Trying to set up alliances between groups and sort of trying to forge, peaceful relationships and all these sorts of things. Spain and the Netherlands, and anyway, lots of history is about this, and so. We see, though, in chapter 3 and in verse 3 and following, that the famous wisdom request of Solomon comes about. And again, I know we're sort of skipping a bit, brushing over the surface, and we can probably do a whole month just on Solomon being granted wisdom, and some of this will carry out. So the next 3 lessons we'll look at the specific books of Solomon. Obviously, one of those, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes in particular, are really encapsulations of Solomon's wisdom. But the point is, and I'm sure it's been well made and well taught, and sure it's been taught in Bible school and here, but when God offers Solomon essentially whatever he may wish for, and the old wish for a million wishes kind of thing, he asks for wisdom. He asks for, I think it would be pretty safe to say that it's the greatest thing to ask for when God's offering it, especially surely when you're leader of a nation, when it would seem responsible for moral leadership, for legal judgments, for deciding on war, deciding on things that affect people's lives. And so we're told that Solomon, none were as wise as him. And we have the example in the latter half of 1 Kings chapter 3. Again, I suspect a very well-known example of the contested child, and Solomon saying, well, okay, let's cut the child in two, and essentially calling people's bluff, working on the theory that the genuine mother of the child would do anything to protect the child, and the mother who wasn't would be somewhat more callous and cavalier and be quite comfortable with the child being put to death as her own child was, or had died at least. And so no doubt, many other there were many other examples of Solomon exercising his wisdom, and we see in Proverbs especially kind of I think it's pretty clear the principles that underlined how he saw life and how it should be lived, and that practical application of knowledge, of godly understanding, of taking on all that he had been taught, no doubt, at the foot of David and perhaps Zadok the priest, and that he was then himself wanting to share with the sort of imagined child of Proverbs in the audience. And I don't know, I think it's really wonderful that wisdom is such a prominent feature of the Bible, and that it is celebrated and, in essence, personified in the life of Solomon. Again, David a lot of good characteristics, and we probably spent a lot of time looking at, sort of his acts of heroism and these sorts of things, and his personal relationship with God, and also, again, a lot of the politicking and a lot of the ways in which his life, played out. But in Solomon here, we have something more abstract, something more, I suppose, theoretical, if you like. This is for all of us. This is, we don't all fight Goliath. We don't all express our faith in grand psalms while we're on the run and our life being threatened. But we can all take on wisdom. We can all understand, how many proverbs can you name off the top of your head versus other verses of the Bible? I suspect once you got going, there would be a good percentage of, and I suspect if you asked around about, a fair chunk of what people who are not very Bible literate could quote, and maybe they don't even recognize it's from the Bible, would be Proverbs. And there is a universality to it, and Daniel will be teaching on Proverbs, so not to steal from that, but obviously it links here quite closely with this request for wisdom and the granting of wisdom. And I have not done a grand study of the Quran and of the Bhagavad Gita and all of the great, and perhaps not so great religious works of the world, but from the perspective of a Christian, from the perspective of a student of the Bible, wisdom is a central plank of that. God sharing with his children the best way to live the life. And then it's not just about do this, don't do this. And it's not just these sort of vague precepts. And my understanding, again, of the likes of the Quran is that it's very widely open to interpretation and these sorts of things, whereas there are specific principles that are delivered through Solomon. James is called the Proverbs of the New Testament. Again, it's a book of practically explaining to us how the world works and how we are to be our best selves in that. And so, wisdom and its central place in the Bible should never be kind of discounted or overlooked. Yes, the gospel, the Bible we know is lots of things, and yes, we have the picture of Jesus, and no, none of us are going to emulate the perfect life of Jesus, but in the Sermon on the Mount and in the parables, we have forms of wisdom being conveyed to us, forms of living a right and proper way. And so I think from the king celebrated as the richest of all and perhaps the most peaceful of all of Israel's kings, for wisdom to be kind of the central tenet of his life, I think is something that we need to bear in mind, take on board, celebrate, learn from, learn with, to be wise when one could be wealthy, when one could be powerful, when one could, have asked for all sorts of other things. To be wise first and foremost is a really important priority setting wake-up call for me, I think. Do I actively seek out God's wisdom? Do I ask for it as the first and foremost thing in my life? And that'll be one of the questions that we're left with at the end of tonight's class. It's important to recognize too that, and as we saw in that example that's presented there, but we're told sort of from verse 20 onwards in 1 Kings chapter 4 that Solomon reigned in wisdom, and we're told in verses verse. Where are we? Sorry. We'll read from verse 20 down to 25. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. Quite different from so much of Judges and of David and Saul's reign. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. We're told all of his provisions. He said, for he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tipshah even to Gaza, namely over all the kings on this side of the river. And he had peace on every side all around him. That was the bit I was looking for. So again, here's a man who asks for wisdom, and here's a man who has peace on all around about him. Coincidence? Saul was a man of brittle temperament, fragile ego, great anger. He did not seem to have much peace in his life, and certainly, not all around about him. David, yes, a man after God's own heart, but David also a warrior. David, a leader of armies. It's Solomon who's able to, it seems, despite the purges initially in his reign, to find a way to step back from some of that and to actually, again, through, I'm sure, his wisdom and through God's blessing, able to have some peace in the land, have some joy. And again, I think there's little lessons in that for us too, is that I don't think any of us are leading armies, but we can be at war with people. We can have our lives full of, fractious relationships, full of where's the next fight coming from, not picking our battle, fighting every battle. And I'm not talking about standing up for moral rightness or that. I'm talking about, picking at people or sniping or undermining or all the little ways in which we can sort of make lives miserable for other people. And we can go on doing that, but or we might feel like we're always right and everyone else is wrong and stupid, and why can't they see the world as me? And we just keep fighting them because we're so strong-minded in how we see the world. And I think there's got to be a time where we lay down arms, or where we decide that there's got to be a different way, that maybe I'm responsible for peace in this world. And I need to take that on as a responsibility. And we're told that, blessed are the peacemakers, and we're told that, Christ is Prince of Peace, and all of these sorts of things. And again, I don't think those things should be diminished. And I know our pride says, yeah, but, or what about? And I get all of that, but I also understand that Christ said, lay aside that pride and consider others more important than ourselves. And I think in some strange sort of a way, we have here a small example perhaps of, peace coming about because a wise leader decided to lay down some of those cudgels and to perhaps govern in a slightly different way for a while. And again, not unrelated, I think, is that God allows Solomon to build the temple where he is to sort of have a more permanent home. Obviously, they've been a nomadic people leaving Egypt into the wilderness, and that even though they settled the land, that obviously through Judges it wasn't completely done so, and that it wasn't until David where they even sort of really established Jerusalem as the central administrative and religious capital. And so finally Solomon's allowed to build what we recognize as the kind of first grand temple. And again, you can read all of the detail that is around about there. But I think verses 11 to 13 is, again, really instructive. So we're told there in chapter 6 and verse 11 that the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments, and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David, and I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. Again, I think it's really interesting to note here that in the midst of a very physical building, construction, all of the, and again, the whole idea of the description there, I think, is to capture some of the grandeur of what was being done. But even in amongst all of that, God's focus is still on what? It's still on obedience. It's still on his statutes, his principles, the behavior of people. He doesn't necessarily, he allowed this grand place to be built, no doubt. And I suspect it created a sense of awe in worshippers and whatnot. But at its heart still, God, Micah 6:6-8, doesn't it say? And several other places that God wants us first and foremost, beyond whatever we want to build, and that's where our focus should be. And if it's a choice between the two, it needs to be our behavior, our obedience. Chapter 7 has a lengthy description of Solomon's house and then the furnishings of the temple. So, the real estate lift out guide, it's nothing new. It was back there in First Kings, a grand description of a place that you wish you had, sort of thing. So, it's really, really interesting that the linkages here, that wisdom comes first, and then the wealth comes after that. And so very often we like to put it around the other way. So then in chapter 8 we see this grand, the ark returning. So God kind of taking his central and right place. Again, I won't go through all of the text, but you can read chapter 8 from verses 12 onwards. We have Solomon giving a sermon, and then Solomon also giving a prayer. And again, mindful of the godly relationship that Solomon does have, despite the failings of his later years and his descent into immorality. I think there is still, as we saw in his request to God for wisdom and in the way in which he reigns, there is still that I think a strong relationship to God, and God to Solomon, and God obviously to his chosen people, whom Solomon represents. Again, famously in chapter 10, we have the multiplication of Solomon's wealth, of his horses. We have, Queen of Sheba coming to visit. Just a very different time, a very different type of reign, a very different tone and tenor to the description compared to the likes of Saul and David. It's quite remarkable, the shift. As I said, even though at the start there does seem to be this sort of settling of scores that's sort of built into the DNA of leaders, but nevertheless, it seems like the majority of his time is quite different. And perhaps, and we noted when David seemed to be at his most settled, that was when he had his great failing with Bathsheba. And likewise, Solomon, when he does reach this sort of zenith of wealth and of understanding and insight, this is when he seems to be falling and failing. He intermarries with foreign women. There is not wisdom. There's worship of idols. God rebukes him. God chastises him. We see in Ecclesiastes, which we'll look at in a bit more depth, a real bitterness to the latter days of his life, it would seem. That great claim of vanity, of emptiness, of questioning what it's all worth. And this from, the richest and most peaceful of all leaders. Like, if he can't figure stuff out, then what hope the rest of us have? So again, the Bible doesn't resile from these facts. The Bible doesn't present Solomon as simply, a mythical creature of wisdom and wealth, but it presents his moral failings in all of their clarity as well. And again, as warnings for us, Jesus says on a number of occasions, and most famously, that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to have a close relationship with God, essentially. And here we have proof of this, proof that pride, trust in these things, or novelty, or the next big barn, that all of these things crowd out and these weeds clutch at us. And again, that central relationship that Solomon does have, and that does demonstrate trust in God, that these things can be lost. These things can be overgrown, crowded out. And Solomon, I think, is a lesson, a warning, an admonition for us for those very same things that Christ warned us about, and that we surely are no less immune from, no less challenged by. So the wisdom of Solomon and not the wealth of Solomon is, I think, what we should be aspiring after and taking on board. We'll close our non-discussion class, I suppose.